The following slideshow discusses a topic of a critical discussion of visual examples of different graffiti and their conceptual relationship with urban spaces in which we encounter them. The presentation discusses examples of graffiti works and the conceptual relationship that these works have to urban spaces in which we encounter them. This topic is a potentially vast one because of its qualitative nature. This nature allows graffiti to share multiple conceptual relationships with urban spaces in which we encounter them. And this can depend on who is criticizing and as well as other conditions. One of the primary relationships that graffiti shares with its urban space is that of a response to or commentary on that particular urban environment. Graffiti can be used to bring our attention to the issues within the space they are created. It can juxtapose or even reflect the quality, condition, or state of the urban spaces in which we encounter them. This presentation discusses three other conceptual relationships that emerge under and in relation to this primary relationship. These are that graffiti forms an urban experience and defines an urban space. Graffiti is commonly encountered within urban spaces, and for this reason, it can form an urban experience and also define an urban space. The second relationship that I will discuss is that graffiti develops or declines the aesthetic value of an urban space in which it is encountered. This relationship in turn affects other factors regarding the experience, view, and development of that urban space. Lastly, graffiti contests public and private space within an urban environment. This particular relationship is associated with some of the common motivations for the practice of graffiti. The further discussions of these relationships will be made observing various examples of graffiti artworks and the conceptual relationships which they share with the urban spaces in which they are encountered. Both the aesthetics and the practice of graffiti are key to understanding graffiti in the urban space. The slideshow begins with providing a definition of graffiti, its aesthetics and practices. It further delves into the relationship mentioned or in the relationships that are mentioned above. So what is graffiti art? Graffiti can be defined in its style and practice. As a style, graffiti started as simple text and has progressed to full-blown art pieces as new forms and style emerged over the years. The art practice was seen as a form of vandalism to public property and as a punishable crime when it first started. Since the text, around the 1980s, the practice was gaining familiarity globally and new graffiti artists began to rise. This came with extended graffiti techniques and critical writings on the practice. Today, the graffiti art scene has evolved to contain a rich variety of universal graffiti styles. As critical writings and discussions on graffiti also developed, these new extended styles were then termed urban or street art or the post-graffiti movement. This was due to the increasing popularity of graffiti and discourses that challenged the criminalization of the practice. Nevertheless, by terming the extension of the graffiti styles the post-graffiti movement, critics suggested graffiti not as a developed art form, but rather as one that has stopped and inspired a new art form, drawing a critical distinction between graffiti art and what is seen as vandalism. The term post-graffiti and street art both emerged in the United States. However, graffiti has seen an almost global shift to greater tolerance and gains in prominence of popular culture. In countries such as France and Germany, the global graffiti culture started intersecting with local political opinions. Graffiti in South Africa followed a similar trajectory. According to Kane Wadaker, author of the book Graffiti South Africa, contemporary graffiti as an art form was first introduced to South Africa through the work of Martha Cooper and Henry Chalfant with the publication of their book Subway Art. It was during this time that graffiti was first taken up in Cape Town as a response to the book, and also as a response to the global rise of hip-hop music. When hip-hop music rose in Cape Town, it also influenced the graffiti in Johannesburg. South Africa's graffiti largely derived from Western art styles, and with the exposure of Western graffiti also came the understanding of the graffiti subculture. Graffiti is commonly found in urban environments. It can be found in almost any major city in the world. When it started, graffiti was inclined to street cred, association with gangs, and was politically charged. Public walls and buildings were strategically selected so that everyone who walked past them can see the graffiti work. While graffiti on subways, artists intentionally seeked hidden spots because the practice was more street cred inclined, territory marking, and also gang markings. Graffiti is commonly found on public property or private property adjacent to public space in urban spaces. Other public spaces where graffiti can be found are places such as transportation systems, shelter buildings, fences of public infrastructure, monuments, and others. Even though graffiti can be found in all these various public places, graffiti writing started on trains because trains made their way all around the city. This provided artists with maximum exposure and also a communication channel. Writers could also see the work of graffiti artists in other areas within their city. This helped them to keep up with what they were doing. Trains are dangerous places, especially for people who are not supposed to be there. Therefore, the bigger and more elaborate the writing was on a train, the more street cred a writer would have. This was the same in New York subways. Graffiti made in these spots was illegal, and the writing styles that were often found there are tagging and throw-ups. While graffiti is often characterized by the creative use of alphabetic letters and symbols, ranging from tagging and wild styles, with the emergence of new artists, the graffiti scene encompasses a variety of styles, including the use of stencil posters, stickers, and masterpieces. In the following slides, I will define some of the common styles that are used in graffiti. The first one in figure 1 is tags or tagging. Tagging is the simplest type of graffiti, consisting of the writer's name, a name of a gang or initials of a gang or a symbol. They are usually in one color and they are normally the writer's signature. In figure 2, throw-ups. Throw-ups are similar to tags, but they use 3 bubble letters at most. They are characterized by 2 colors, one used for outlines and the other for filling in. The third style is wild style. Wild style is a more decorative version of throw-ups, consisting of interlocking letters, angles, curves, arrows, and spikes. Wild styles can be difficult to read to non-graffiti artists, but can still be appreciated for their creativity and flow of movements, even though graffiti artists normally write a simpler version of what they have written so that viewers can understand. The fourth one in figure 4 is blockbusters. Blockbusters also form part of the signature of artists, usually in large block letters covering large spaces. The fifth image in Figure 5, this style is referred to as heaven. Heaven refers to any of the above-mentioned graffiti styles, but which are located in high places that may be difficult to reach, such as the top of a tall building. Graffiti artists of these works gain a lot of recognition and respect from other street artists. Figure 6. Stencils. Stencils point to uh, Stencils point to the often simple graffiti writings produced by spraying over a stencil placed against a wall or the selected surface. Figure 7. Stickers. This art style, also known as posters. This graffiti style is easily executed as the artwork can be brought to the graffiti site already produced and ready just to be pasted on the wall or on the surface. The only difference between stickers and posters are the sizes. Posters are larger than stickers. Figure 8. Masterpieces. Masterpieces are also known as pieces. Masterpieces are originally considered a hip-hop form of graffiti, but have grown to refer to graffiti works that require a significant amount of skill of both lettering and pictorial drawings. They normally depict pictorial drawings, and when they depict letters, they are more elaborate than text and throw-ups, and are stylistically drawn to have feel and background colors. The last style is 3D in Figure 9. 3D are graffiti artworks that give an illusion that the graffiti is in three-dimensional. In this slide, I will give a brief history and practice of graffiti. While modern graffiti only rose to prominence in the 1960s, curators have shown that graffiti art forms come into existence long before the 20th century. It can be traced to way before that. The term graffiti was originally used to describe inscriptions and other writings found in historical and heritage sites or cities. Other references to graffiti date back to the 1407 in Italy, where it was associated with social movements and other societal issues such as epidemics, natural disasters, records of wars, as well as the demolition and erection of buildings. The graffiti scene has a history of being embroiled in politics and social matters. Consequently, the public often associate graffiti with times of social unrest. This also forms part of the negative views of graffiti and how it is seen as an act that has to be governed by strict government laws and police officials. Also, given that graffiti was mainly practiced by the subculture of society. When contemporary graffiti spread on the African continent, in countries such as Nigeria, Libya, Egypt, South Africa, and others, it was not a new phenomenon, and it already had strong ties to political contestations and struggles. As a result, just like the European countries and in America, governments have made some efforts to remove graffiti. In South Africa, graffiti was mostly utilized by sidelined and oppressed youth as a form of expression and opposition to the apartheid regime. Resistance to the apartheid government sparked political graffiti in South Africa, which at the time acted as a public voice for the oppressed even before it was influenced by the emergence of the New York contemporary graffiti scene. As a result, South African graffiti consisted of a tone of a resistance that engaged with politics of identity and space. During the apartheid government, it was common to come across illegal graffiti that challenged the authority and that also spoke to reclaiming land. Writers used spray paint and stencils as they could quickly be repeated, and as a result were found across many sites. The graffiti here was characterized by text-based political slogans in either English or Afrikaans, and was a jailable offense, treated as an aggressive act of defiance or indicative of an uprising. However, since 1994, graffiti artists and the graffiti subculture in South Africa began to be less engaged with politics and more with the free artistic expression, especially with the growing influence of the New York hip-hop culture on graffiti. Audiences also became more captivated by the art form's free-spirited nature, but actually had little knowledge about the accompanying subculture. The urban graffiti scene has changed direction in the post-apartheid South Africa, evolving into a more expressive art form, although still falling short of evolving into a distinctive South African style. Today, more and more graffiti is being seen as valuable and contributing to urban aesthetic and placemaking by creating meaningful or identifiable spaces rather than as negative. There is now a growing, rich, and vibrant graffiti culture globally. Graffiti can share countless conceptual relationships with urban spaces in which it is encountered. The next slides look at 3 conceptual relationships for discussion. The first one that I look at is graffiti forms an urban experience and defines an urban space. Graffiti is an art form that is primarily found in urban spaces because of its historical practices. Graffiti art that ranges from its use for social commentary, gang tags, to recent expressive practices took place within the urban environment. Thus, graffiti is now commonly an art form that is associated with urban spaces. It is seldom that one would expect to find graffiti writings in suburban or rural areas, even though graffiti has also seen a spread in townships. In fact, graffiti in suburban or rural areas might come across as out of place. In the same way, it is seldom not to come across any form of graffiti writing in an urban space. The following examples depict various graffiti art expressed in different ways across various urban cities across the globe. The images depict different types of graffiti writings that one may come across in various urban spaces. One can go anywhere in an urban landscape and will come across some form of graffiti writing. For example, in the first image, the photograph is taken from a top view of part of an urban location in New York. The image depicts a rooftop of various residential and commercial buildings in the urban location. The buildings, as well as the rooftop, are covered with graffiti tags and throw-ups. This is not an uncommon view in many residential and commercial buildings, as well as rooftop in the urban spaces. The second image is from Bristol, UK, a native town of the famous graffiti artist Branksy. This is an image depicting an area in the city where Europe hosts a creative festival in summer. In the festival, artists are invited to paint some neighborhoods in the urban area. This festival attracts creatives and tourists from all over the world. This is also one of the growing traditional experiences in many urban areas in the world since the growing interest in graffiti as a creative art form that can foster urban development. Such creative events, which invite various artists to paint graffiti in some public areas in the city for the aesthetic development of the area as well as for tourist attractions, have recently become highly synonymous with the urban experience. These next images are two different graffiti styles found in two different cities of Johannesburg. The first image is found at Gandhi Square in the central city of Johannesburg. This beautiful masterpiece by Faith 47, who is a well-known female artist. The painting seems randomly placed in the midst of a highly busy part of the city, which does not make immediate sense of its location within the city, especially for an art piece of its style. But in actuality, this kind of graffiti and placement forms part of a common urban experience. The masterpiece, even as eye-catching, can be an unnoticeable part of the urban experience if one is in the midst of the business of the city. A big part is that this form of graffiti practice is not unusual in an urban setting. Various kinds of large-scale masterpieces that seem randomly placed in a part of an urban space that do not even seem to resemble the aesthetic aura of the artwork can be found all around the city of Johannesburg and other areas in different urban spaces. The fourth image depicts random tags that are found on side walls in the streets of Hillbrow, Johannesburg. These kind of graffiti are also highly common in urban spaces globally. They are normally even more common in downtown and dangerous parts of urban spaces. This kind of graffiti is normally associated with vandalism and the graffiti subculture. In the particular context of this image, such graffiti writing can resemble or even define the condition of that particular urban space in which they are painted. In this next slide are examples of other graffiti writings that one can experience all around different parts of urban spaces. All these examples depict how graffiti forms part of experiencing an urban space and how it becomes one of the visual characteristics that define an urban space. Graffiti provides an urban experience that defines urban streets as places of both travel and visual critical discourse. And this has become a normal experience of an urban environment. The art form forms part of the overall urban experience, defining a particular area as an urban area. This is also linked to John R. Wick's statement in defining urban areas. The writer stated that we all know an urban place when we see it. He defines urban as being characteristics of place rather than of people, and part of the characterization of the urban place are expressed by the practice and art of graffiti. Another relationship that graffiti shares with the urban spaces in which it is encountered is that graffiti develops or declines the aesthetic value of an urban space. To discuss this, I analyzed graffiti examples found in two different urban areas in the city of Johannesburg. This is the area of Maboneng. where the graffiti art scene is booming and attracts locals and international tourists to the area. And then I also look at Hillbrow, where the graffiti scene is almost dismal and forms part of the reasons that drive people away from the area. These two examples show that graffiti can be practiced or expressed in a way that can reflect a positive or even a negative state of the urban area in which it is encountered. This positive or negative aesthetic value of graffiti in an urban space in which it is encountered, in turn, enhances or can lower the general urban environment. It also affects additional factors such as the quality of the urban space, the experience of the space, or the development state of the urban area. This slide depicts the graffiti scene in the area of Maboneng. Maboneng is a vibrant and creative environment in the city of Johannesburg. It is a lively, creative space that encourages multi-diversity, freedom of individual expression, as well as positivity. The graffiti art in the space is commissioned to particularly reflect this. The developers of Maboneng have created a strong public graffiti presence in the area, and the area now boasts several large-scale graffiti artworks produced through street art festivals as well as artistic commissions. In addition, the area has attracted significant attention from graffiti artists, which contributes substantially to the aesthetic identity of the area. The practice of graffiti, as well as the graffiti styles in the area, are made to complement the vibrancy of the area itself. Graffiti here is commissioned, it's non-political, non-gang related, it is deemed legal, and it is created primarily for aesthetic practices. The most dominating graffiti style, as seen in the images, are the masterpieces, as they are vibrant and artistic. They are also a socially accepted means of painting graffiti on public spaces. When practiced within the socially and government accepted conditions, graffiti can drive tourists to the particular area in which it is found. With this knowledge, the developers of Maboneng took that approach in developing the graffiti art scene in the area. The developers of the area invited graffiti artists and muralists to have their way with the public spaces within the area. The condition, though, is that the artworks must speak to what is termed the post-graffiti movement tendencies. It must have that artistic and tourist attraction value. As in some cases, a graffiti piece, even though it could not be commissioned in a certain community, the community may still decide to accept and even appreciate the public art piece rather than destroy it because it has that artistic and tourist value. In Maboneng, the developers had to consider various conditions of the graffiti being expressed in the space. One of the biggest conditions that make graffiti attractive and acceptable to people who experience it is the style of the graffiti. Because of the associations that come with the various styles of graffiti, there is a hierarchy between the different styles of graffiti. This hierarchy, although, depends on context. In the graffiti subculture, for example, the script style will be highly credited than the masterpieces and other styles that emerged with the commodifying of the practice. In spaces of urban renewal, though, it is the other way around, as more expressive styles are preferred. Similarly, the graffiti styles of the Maboning art scene are dominated by the masterpieces, which are accompanied by other various styles that are more artistic and design-like. Then there is a minimum inclusion of tagging and other graffiti styles associated with the legal practice of graffiti. Graffiti in Maboning accommodates various styles and free expression, even though most of these expressions are in the form of masterpiece and design style. Many of the artworks are commemorative or significant to prominent people or social meaning. The artworks are also made primarily for aesthetic purposes. The graffiti scene in Maboning is colorful and creative, and it's placed strategically to complement each other and also the urban space of Maboning. These considerations of graffiti practices play a big role in their positive reception and can work more for positive aesthetic development of an urban space instead of decreasing it. Because graffiti relates to larger processes of urban and economic development in their urban spaces. This development of the aesthetic value in Maboning through graffiti in turn affects the positive view and reception of the area and the graffiti within the area. It sparks the positive interest in the urban space as well as experiences of that urban space. Graffiti in Maboning contributes to the creative vibrancy and free positive expression in the space. Graffiti as practice in Maboning demonstrates that graffiti can have an aesthetic value with the relationship it shares with an urban space. It can signify the redevelopment of a neighborhood, distinguish the area from surrounding spaces, and also project a global aesthetic. In this respect, graffiti is being leveraged to nurture urban development, creative economies, and tourism. On the other hand, graffiti can have a negative consequence for public space even beyond the de-evaluation of property. Graffiti that is associated with gang culture, illegalism, and being used to express political and social concerns in the public domain can have a negative implication on its urban space. Not entirely because all of the practice is bad, but also because of the social views towards the art form. And this kind of graffiti can be seen to be working against the redevelopment of an urban space in which it is encountered. The images in this slide are examples of graffiti art that is found in the streets of Hillbrow. Hillbrow is one of the most dangerous urban spaces in the city of Johannesburg. The area is associated with high levels of gang-related violence and crime, and as depicted in the images, the graffiti in the area is reflective of this view. Firstly, most of the practice of graffiti in the area is illegal and is considered vandalism. The graffiti writings are done freely by the artists without any mutual consent of the beneficiaries or developers of the area, which also speaks to the point of contesting of public space within urban areas. Nevertheless, this kind of graffiti practice normally results in a negative implications of the urban space in which the graffiti is practiced and also a negative view on the art form. The dominating graffiti style in the Hillbrow art scene is very simple tags and throw-ups. These styles are styles that are socially associated with outlaws and gangs and reflect that kind of fearful aura in an area. This practice also reflects general views among local authorities that graffiti is an element of urban decay or neglect, and that it is suggestive of crime in the area. In 2016, Johannesburg's mayor Herman Mashaba declared that he would eradicate graffiti through stricter bylaws to create an investor-friendly environment in the city of Johannesburg. This view contradicts the positive practice of graffiti in Maboneng, which actually drives the investor-friendly environment. However, it speaks to the graffiti practice in Hillbrow, as the perceptions of this kind of graffiti practice does not drive an investor-friendly urban space. These two examples show that graffiti can develop or decline the aesthetic value of an urban space in which it is encountered. This is highly dependent on the practice and styles of the graffiti, which are mainly also driven by the style associations and also social views. The last point of discussion of the relationship that graffiti shares with its urban space is that graffiti contests public and private space within an urban environment. One of the significant relationships that emerge in the practice of graffiti, especially because of its public nature, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it contests the production and ownership of public urban spaces. And it continues to do this even within increasingly commodified practices. Urban places are made of both private and public spaces, such as buildings and infrastructure. Graffiti highlights this distinction of private and public spaces within the urban areas, as the practice of graffiti can act as a form of public space marker. It intentionally or unintentionally carves out our shared social spaces in public spaces and on public urban infrastructure. The presented images are examples of graffiti art that demonstrate this point. The graffiti images presented here depict public spaces which are gold mines for graffiti writers and opportunities for a publicized freedom of expression. Graffiti artists have claimed visible spaces on bridges, on billboards, on trains, on residential buildings, and so forth in these examples. And graffiti artists continue to do this even when municipal authorities are continually seeking to stop them, mainly in the illegal context. These battles over space occur because the street is public in its orientation and creation, in its access and in its passage, but it is privatized in its use and restrictions. Not all graffiti artists engage intentionally in the contesting of public and private space when creating their artworks, but the public nature of the practice and also the dependency on public infrastructure includes them in the discourse. Nevertheless, graffiti artists who intentionally engage in this discourse call into question not only where public space might be located, but also who has the right to use it. In these examples, the contesting of public space or the contesting of public and private spaces is done in all styles of graffiti. This is mainly because the public nature of the practice, as well as the nature of where it is practiced, both in an illegal or commodified context. Therefore, some artists engage in this discourse not with the intention of doing so, but by the nature of the practice, while other artists actively engage in it. This then includes all practitioners of graffiti in this discussion, and thus includes all graffiti practices and styles. All styles from tagging to stencils and 3D, and from the dodgy to the more sophisticated urban spaces, they are all involved in this position, as seen here. Although public spaces is intended to be accessible to all, it is frequently managed through powerful public and private groups. In this regard, at the heart of these practices are questions about design and control of public space. The contention of graffiti is driven by the need to have the freedom to use the public spaces as they are made to belong to the public and for public use. It is this reason that graffiti artists continue to write in public urban spaces regardless of the practice being a punishable crime in many urban spaces. In turn, local authorities are compelled to respond to the practices of graffiti. A defining element of this contesting relationship of graffiti with urban spaces in which we encounter it is its public urban context. The public context of the practice has made it controversial as vandalism, but also accessible as a form of art. Therefore, graffiti shares a contesting relationship of private and public spaces with urban areas that we encounter it, and the urban streets become critical means of analyzing conversations of contested public and private spaces.